So I get a message, somebody's asking me some questions about something they heard somewhere on the internet. And it was an interesting question. And obviously the EPP stuff still really, I think it's really popular or whatever. People seem to ask a lot. Maybe it's because you can wrap your head around what it is. It's very much training. It's very fitness. It's very ass kicking. It's lifting. It's cardio. Everybody understands. And then we're applying some maybe more sophisticated physiological messages that aren't typically associated with do this and don't do that, or do this way. So one of these pieces was related to illness. And the message that the person asked me about was, hey, this person said that disease can't live in oxygen. I'm like, oh boy, you're right off the bat. That's a kind of a slappy statement. And I said, well, you know what? Try this. You don't know what happens on live TV. Like, you just Google, can disease live in oxygen? And we can suggest anything we want in terms of the validity and the utility even of what we find on the internet. But that's the same source that said, relative same source of the internet that said that disease can't live in oxygen. Obviously, that's foolish. And as I did it myself, it shows very, very quickly that certain, particularly viruses, can live in the presence of oxygen. They thrive in presence of oxygen. Sometimes people get excited and I don't know, maybe they were trying to sell something that was oxygenating, or I don't know. But regardless, there is something very significant to learn here as it relates to EPP. And maybe this is what that person was really trying to say. I am skeptical that if somebody's going to make a crazy statement like that, I'm skeptical that they have the physiological background. But maybe there is a link here that we can maybe put together, maybe draw some lines here. Now, we know that when you overtrain, it is very possible that you get a runny nose. Now, how does that happen? We know this. We know that when you're sick from something, the training process is mitigated. Well, how does that happen? Well, aside from saying everything is linked, everything is connected, everything matters, of course, that's a reality. But there's an acute scope as it relates to the immune system and the particular parts of the immune system that relate to certain types of physical exertion. And that's how we'll link this back to a message of illness and oxygen, okay? Let's start by saying oxygen is not your friend. We have gone through several posts recently that would suggest that oxygen is not as happy a thing as we tend to think. It is, of course, an obligatory player in the game, but it is not as welcoming. It can certainly be toxic. If you hang out in a hyperbaric chamber, hyperoxygenated environment over a certain period of time, you can literally die. So oxygen is not like in this unchecked abundance, this only positive thing. And in fact, our breathing, as we have discussed, is driven by the buildup of CO2, not the search of oxygen. So, the question that Coach Boyle asked when I was there last week, hey, do you think we should be working on breath holds? I said yes. And of course, there's other training models that can mimic the same environment of a breath hold. So anyway, let's go back to the link of how we get ill. Now, if we draw like a dotted line, you see I'm not doing it down the middle, I'm doing it over here because in theory, everything from here to here up to VO2 max is going to use energy systems that predominantly rely on oxygen, and everything over here to the right does not predominantly rely on oxygen. Now, why is that important? Well, when we are on the right side of that line, we have talked to ad nauseum that those energy systems are more costly. Nothing is free, but if we want to train at that level, which in theory is training harder, which in theory is jumping higher and running faster and punching with more ruthless aggression, then we have to pay for that. And we are able to generate ATP very, very quickly. We can constantly use, if we are in an abundance of carbohydrates, they can be translated, whatever the physiological word is, into glucose much, much quicker than fats or carbs, fats or proteins. So that's how we can continue to train aggressively, and then we rest, okay? So now the part of the cost to using those glycolytic pathways, I'll get into the big fancy words before I get in trouble. We're just gonna say that those costs are oxidants, where maybe you take antioxidants, and well, antioxidants are against oxidants. So you can also see the base of oxygen isn't always a good thing. Now, reactive oxygen species and peroxidation of lipids are two of your main culprits that are now just floating around, if you will, in this, I like to think of things in cartoon. These are bad guys, and they are recognized by the body as pathological, even though they're not a microbe, they're not a bacteria, they're not a virus, nobody sneezed on you, etc. But these are part of the costs that you pay, and those costs have to be mitigated as an immune response. So if there's this, just think of it in a general way, if there's this abundance of reactive oxygen species because of the choices that you made in training, then you will trigger this immune response. And in all immune responses, the initial warrior, the initial fight is initiated by T cells, cytotoxic T cells. Sometimes these are called the special operations of the immune system. CD4 cells and the helper T cells are CD8 cells. And why are they the first one? Because this is a new thing to the body. Now, what isn't new? Well, what happens is the T cells will attack, and if this invader, in this case, not this one, not the reactive oxygen species, but let's say it is a microbe and they have antigens, well, then the body can make antibodies and then B cells. Then the heat comes, and then there's all sorts of cascades and equations, some of which lead to a histamine response where you blow your nose, okay? But the reactive oxygen species and peroxidation of lipids, these do not have antigens. They don't have antigens. And that's why you can only fight them, and balance them with T cells. You can't bring the heat, you can't bring the cavalry, because there's no antibodies, that you can't make an antibody for something that you develop from training. And that's a unique component, and that's where in my mind, and as I interpret the science and the literature, because I really, when there's ever a PhD, I want to learn about the immune system as it relates to physical activity, and then we're going to get back to disease, because that's the bridge. The bridge is really what I am describing in terms of now illness comes into play, that if you are constantly training foolishly, under recovering, overstressed, because we know that those glycolytic pathways can be triggered through sympathetic social environments. And we also know that your resting metabolic environment, that if you're constantly using carbs at rest rather than fat in the slow burn, why would you be using the fast paper that my buddy Andy Galpin describes? Why are you constantly putting paper on the fire when you have all this wood to use in this long process? The real issue is now that you're using the carbs, glycolytic pathways, you're going to build up these oxidants, the reactive oxygen species, peroxidation of lipids. And now those things, let's just say they wreak havoc. They mess things up. They get in the way of things. They don't let this bind. They don't let that bind, and all sorts of crazy things happen. So if you don't have this wild, enormous team of T cells, of cytotoxic T cells, well, then those oxidants start to oxidize things. And you run into this propensity and this increased risk of now other types of invaders are no longer being able to be fought off. And that's when illness can happen. So let's go back to the statement. Of course, it's terribly slappy and ridiculous to say that disease can't live in oxygen. That's ridiculous. However, if you take that, and I did this on purpose, for someone whose activity is fairly sub-threshold, here, middle, left, but their energy systems and their general conditioning and their health is so piss poor that what they do here is similar to what they do here. So now they're just doing nothing. They're walking around, they're doing a little bit of work at 100 heart rate, but it's similar to what would be if their heart rate was like 160, and that's a gross exaggeration. The fact is that somebody who's miserably out of shape and has very, very poor work capacity for any given activity, they're going to wind up building up these reactive oxygen species and peroxidation of lipids, and there's no overall amount of T cells that can fight off everything. So that's why you will have this propensity to get sick. It's not just from the reactions of fighting off the bad guys, the fallout, the collateral damage. But now, if they're there and the T cells are being used, and now other invaders come in, And it's very, very difficult to fight those off, particularly if they're new and fresh and you don't have antibodies for that particular illness. And of course, there's many, we can call an illness one word and there could be thousands of different variations of which each one would have its own very unique type of antibody. So of course, the link there to me makes a lot of sense. However, again, we cannot say that disease can't live in oxygen. That's absolutely, really unfortunate. I hope that individual reevaluates their, and the likelihood that they're watching this is very, very low, of course. But now you can see that if you are able to use oxygen for more than a standard amount of activity, you'll build up less ROS and POL, and then you won't have to use those T cells nearly as much, and you'll have the T cells to be able to react to other types of foreign invaders and trigger that immune response that way without getting sick. The immune system wins. Now, how do you develop high levels of cytotoxic T cells? Train hard, train heavy, and recover properly. I mean, I think one of the things that I have tried to explore is, hey, listen, I want to learn, how do I eat for T cells? What are the micronutrients? What is a T cell made out of? And how do I make sure from a nutrition supplementation or even pharmaceutical approach, how do we make sure that we have those pieces to the puzzle so that when the body is triggered to adapt to increase volume of cytotoxic T cells, we have the raw materials? That's something that certainly excites me. If anybody has those answers or someone that specializes in this approach, I would love to hear about that. So always, the more warriors you show up with, of course, we're going to lose some. That's just how war works. And we're going to lose some of these in this adaptation process, and the price that we pay for those types of adaptations that are more costly. Now we see the price. The price that we have to pay is this potential immune response for those glycolytic byproducts. We say exhaust and byproducts. Well, there's a whole nother thing that happens after glycolysis is triggering a couple ATPs. So that's how we can get sick from being overtrained, under-recovered, and it's how illness can flourish when we're in those unfortunate environments. So hopefully that makes sense. Anybody seen a leprechaun? Say, yeah.